morning. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all so very much for joining us, and thank you all for your ongoing support. We couldn't be doing this without you. The need for these nonpartisan, informed discussions like today with Dan Schnur are more critical than ever before. So if you have a chance, go to our website at lawac.org and see how you can become more involved. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's program, our weekly series with Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with Dan Schnur. Dan's three topics today will be, number one, when and how will COVID-19 allow schools to open? Two, immigration, Trump, the Supreme Court, and the American people. And third, America's most experienced voters weigh their option. I know that all of you that follow Dan's weekly series know the drill with respect to submitting questions, but if there's anyone new out there, we'll be taking questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. And our Vice President of Events, Jessica Duganzik, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. And as always, Jessica will try to take as many of your questions as possible. So Dan, can't wait for today's program. I turn it over to you, and thank you so much.
Kim, thank you so much. And thanks as well to all of you for joining us each week. We've been having these conversations since late March, early April, and each week it's been a really interesting experience for me to hear all of your thoughts and observations and questions on the topics we discuss. So as Kim mentioned, I really do hope that when we enter the second portion of today's webinar, that you weigh in with your questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. So now last week, 7 days ago, we talked about the reluctance of Americans to respect social distancing guidelines. And over just the last few days, we've seen in very stark terms the impact of that reluctance. This week, as all of you know, we've seen a very sharp increase in the number of COVID-19 cases, and not just the number of cases, but more important, as we discussed last week, in equally troubling increases in the rates of transmission and the number of hospitalizations here in California and around the country. Yesterday was the single highest number of new cases nationally that we've seen throughout the pandemic, and the highest number of new cases we've seen here in California as well. But we discussed the broader challenge last week at some length, and so today, as Kim mentioned, what we're hoping to do is focus in a little bit on one of the key challenges that the COVID-19 virus presents to us, and that's the question of when and how will the pandemic allow our schools to reopen? So first, let's start that conversation with a quick look at where we are now. Earlier this week, Governor Newsom and the state legislature agreed on a budget here in California. And in that budget, it made clear that schools are being encouraged to offer in-person instruction, quote, to the greatest extent possible. And they say that schools can offer distance learning if ordered by a health official, or for students who are medically at risk or who are self-quarantining because of exposure to COVID-19. But I think you'd agree that to the greatest extent possible is pretty murky guidance. And we're seeing the same dynamic in other states where the state government is weighing in and essentially saying, we're going to let the schools make these decisions for themselves. Now, obviously, with the number of cases rising so dramatically, as I talked about a moment ago, our natural instinct is to say, of course, we can't open the schools. We can't expose our children and their families to the danger of a further spread of the virus. But before we leap to that conclusion, and I'm not arguing against it, but I think it is worth taking a minute just to reflect on some of the other considerations that must come into play when a school or school district decides whether to return to in-person learning or to maintain with online and distance learning. There's been research just released this week, a report done by the company McKinsey, which shows that remote learning, if it were to continue until January of 2021, if remote learning were to continue through the fall semester of K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade, that delay in the return to in-person learning could set the average student behind 7 months academically as to where they'd be otherwise, given the combined distance learning component of this last spring and the upcoming fall. 7 months. And as you might guess, given the racial disparity and the socioeconomic disparity in access to computers and to home internet connections, that would heighten the achievement gaps even greater for at-risk communities. African American and Hispanic students would lose 9 or 10 months of learning as a result of a continued distance approach. And of course, when we switch from the academic impact to the economic impact, the same socioeconomic and racial disparities hold. Because even if workplaces reopen with new social distancing measures in place, if businesses open, if restaurants open, if other commercial establishments open, millions of parents around the country, as you know, will only be able to return to work if their children have somewhere to go. And once again, as I mentioned a moment ago, the largest impact is on low-income and minority communities, where for many parents, working from home is simply not a possibility. So that's the education impact. That's the economic impact. Briefly, let's look at the health impact. Because of course, with the rise in rates of viruses, that has to be taken into very serious consideration. Now, what do we know? We know that even though children do contract the COVID-19 virus, we know that children rarely, not never, but rarely get severe cases of the coronavirus. But, and this is a really big but it's very difficult to keep that virus, once a child has contracted it, even if it's not a severe case, it's very difficult to keep that virus spreading among people who live together. And the problem is even greater, as you might imagine, among multi-generational households, where children and parents and grandparents all live in one place. And the problem is even greater than that in households where people are crowded together. So we have economic considerations, we have academic considerations, and we have health considerations. And so the last question before I ask you to weigh in on this is, what do we think of this? How do we weigh the considerations academically, economically, and from a health standpoint? Well, there was a poll done last week and this is before the recent spike in cases. Last week, we saw polling that showed that 54%, a little bit more than half of American voters, said that they were either somewhat uncomfortable or very uncomfortable with reopening kindergarten through 12th grade schools for the beginning of the upcoming school year. 54% of American voters said they're somewhat or very uncomfortable with schools reopening in the fall. And it's worth noting that 67% of African American respondents said that they were uncomfortable with schools responding. Now, this number has been increasing very rapidly. When the same poll was done just a month ago in mid-late May, only 41% of Americans said it was a bad idea for K through 12 schools to open. And just in the last month, we've seen a 13% rise in the response rate to that question. So let's do this. Claire, if you're there, and I know you are, let's ask our audience, let's ask our participants what they think about the advisability of schools reopening. We're going to ask first about K through 12. Should California K through 12 public schools reopen in the fall, or should we continue with distance learning? And we'd like you to tell us, number one, if you think in-person classes come the fall would be appropriate. Number two, if you'd prefer maintaining online learning. And then, of course, the third option is what's now called blended learning, a mixture, a combination of in-person and online education. So let's see what our respondents have to say in answer to this question. 75% say blended learning. And if you combine that with the 7% that say that they want in-person classes, what leaps out at me is more than 80% of our respondents think that having students in classrooms, even some of the time, is worth doing, even given the health risk, given the academic and the educational impactors we talked about a moment ago. Now, we also polled, we didn't poll, Politico polled, and asked the same question about higher education. And so in just a second, we're going to put up a question for you on that. But I will tell you first that when voters were asked, not about whether K through 12 schools should reopen, but whether they were comfortable or uncomfortable with colleges and universities reopening, 48%, a slightly lower number, said that they were very or somewhat uncomfortable with colleges and universities opening up, while 43% said they were comfortable with the idea. Let's see what you think. Let's put up the next question, Claire, and see what our respondents have to say. Should California colleges and universities reopen in the fall, or should we continue with distance learning? And we'll ask you to pick one of the following, just like we did a moment ago. Are in-person classes appropriate for college and university students? Should they stick with online learning for the time being? Or, like you said in answer to the previous question, is blended learning a combination of both what you think is the best way to go? So we'll give everyone just a second to answer, and then we'll hear what you have to say. So let's see the results. So not all that different. 6% in-person classes, 22% online, and 72% blended learning. And what I'll tell you from my own experience, as many of you know, I teach at UC Berkeley, at the University of Southern California, and at Pepperdine University. It appears now that most Berkeley classes for the fall are going to be offered completely online. And at USC, they're still talking about a blended approach, although they're still working on the details of that. So let's move on to our next issue. And I will, just before we move on, what I will say is what we haven't covered, at least not yet, and we can in the second portion of the program, which we'll get to in about 10 minutes, is to address questions about how the reopening will work. What are the mechanics of holding school, whether for college students or for kindergartners or anyone in between? What needs to be done in order to retool these schools very dramatically for social distancing? And again, that's a question hopefully we can talk about a little bit later. But for right now, because I want to get through my three topics so we can move on to your questions sooner rather than later, let's move on and talk about immigration, because of course there's been no shortage of activity on that very important policy issue over the last week. Let's review very quickly. It was just 1 week ago, last Thursday, that the Supreme Court ruled against the Trump administration in deciding to allow the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which was started under President Obama, to continue. As I'm sure most of you remember, when Obama was president, he issued an executive order, given the inability of Congress to act on the issue. Obama issued an executive order saying that young people who were brought to this country without documentation when they were children by their parents would be able to stay in this country. The Trump administration attempted to reverse that executive order, and the Supreme Court said that they could not. Big ruling, big pushback of the Trump administration, and we'll talk more about that a little bit more going forward. Then on Monday, the president issued another executive order of his own. In this executive order, only 3 days after the Supreme Court decision, dramatically reduced legal immigration into this country through a reduction in work-related visas during the pandemic. This is for technology-related work visas, for other types of business work visas, and Trump's executive order reduced the number of visas for international employees by a dramatic number. And we're already seeing signs that this nation of Canada is moving very aggressively to up its recruitment of technology workers from other parts of the world to bring them to Canada instead, given the lack of opportunity that will exist, at least for the time being, here in the United States. Then on Tuesday, the day after his executive order, the president traveled to the state of Arizona. And while he was there, he toured the border wall that is being constructed at the US-Mexico border and actually signed the border wall with his, with his signature. And then today, just earlier this morning, for those of you who didn't see it, the Supreme Court ruled again, this time in favor of the Trump administration. While the Supreme Court last week said that the Trump administration could not suspend the DACA program, today the Supreme Court upheld the Trump administration's belief that the government is not required to provide judicial hearings to individuals who attempt to cross the border here in order to achieve asylum. Now, in addition, in contrast to economic refugees, those who become because of lack of job or economic opportunities in their home countries, those seeking asylum generally have been treated differently in the past. And the Trump administration says that if a border officer does not believe that an individual has a credible claim to asylum, that applicant does not have the right to appeal for a judicial hearing. So what I'd like to do for just a minute before we move on is I'd like to take all those moving pieces on immigration, because it's an awful lot that's happening very quickly, and put it in a political and in a campaign context. So here's what I'd offer you about the state of the presidential campaign at this point. It's pretty clear that at this stage, that the president, in my opinion, is getting a little bit nervous about his re-election prospects. We'll talk a little bit later about Vice President Biden's continued rise in the polls, but there's a lot of other things going on too that I think have Trump and his advisors somewhat on edge. One, as all of you know, his rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma this last weekend, which was supposed to represent a very dramatic return to the campaign trail for Donald Trump, did not come across nearly as well as he and his advisors had hoped. A couple of other things that are worth noting also. Last week, the president did an interview in which he was asked about his concerns by voting by mail. And as you've seen, President Trump has been very outspoken in denouncing mail voting, given his concerns about the spread of mail fraud that could occur if mail voting becomes more prominent. Trump was asked about this, and his response was very interesting. He said, and I'm using his word, not mine, he felt that voting by mail, an expansion of voting by mail, could be the greatest risk posed to his reelection. So obviously he's thinking about this from a self-interested standpoint, but more importantly, what I'd suggest to you is that as the president talks about the dangers of mail voting, what he may be doing is laying the predicate for rationalization if he is not reelected in November. This allowing him to say, I tried to warn the American people about mail voting. It took place anyway, and massive fraud is what cost me reelection. That sounds like someone to me who's not completely convinced of the likelihood of his own reelection. The Trump campaign also last week called for an additional debate. There are 3 debates that take place every presidential cycle, sponsored by a bipartisan commission on presidential debates. And Trump's campaign, after saying in January that they thought that no debates might be necessary, not coincidentally when he was doing much better in the polls, now they're saying that they want more debates. And I would tell you that from my perspective, having worked in politics for many years, worked on many campaigns before I fled to academia, I will tell you that when you're running ahead in a campaign, you try to do as few debates as possible because they're unpredictable. They might even be a little bit dangerous. But if you're behind, it's a time-honored tactic to call for more debates. And when the Trump campaign says we want more debates rather than fewer, that indicates to me that they're getting a little bit nervous too. And then finally, one other point of concern I would add for the Trump campaign is that Vice President Biden is doing much better in public opinion polling with Catholic voters and with evangelical and fundamentalist voters than Hillary Clinton did. Some of that, of course, is that Biden himself is a Catholic, but for other cultural and policy reasons, Biden's doing better with a key part of Trump's base. And while Trump is still winning religious conservatives by a very large margin, well, the fact that Biden's doing better is one more challenge for him that Trump does not need at this point. So what does all this mean? This means that Donald Trump is relying even more than he always has on motivating his base, because right now he sees that as not only his most likely, but perhaps his only path to reelection. And the more motivated and the more excited Donald Trump's most loyal supporters are, the better off he is. And that's why we're seeing much more heightened language from him on immigration policy and on issues having to do with race in order to get those loyal backers as revved up as possible. The voters are judging him very harshly on his handling of the pandemic, almost to the same degree on the issue of police reform. But immigration is an issue that has worked for him since the very beginning. And the fact that he's returning to it as he faces these broader challenges in his reelection shouldn't be surprising. The challenge for Donald Trump is that he's relying on a shrinking pool of white voters. The census announced today in fact, that for the first time in American history, the majority of Americans aged 16 and younger are non-white. And while, of course, those young people under the age of 16 can't vote, it's a very pronounced reminder of the tremendous demographic changes that are taking place in this country. So Trump's base is loyal, but it's shrinking, and that's a potential problem for him. But before we move on to our third and final topic, I'm going to offer you a couple of poll numbers that should give you some pause before you write off Trump's reliance on these issues. Because it's easy for those of us who are here in California, in a deep blue state, or in Los Angeles in the even deeper blue region, it's really easy to forget that not all Americans think about these issues the same way as we do here in California and people in other coastal and blue states do. So two quick statistics for you. Politico, in its morning consult poll, was out last week, and they asked voters who they trusted on a variety of issues. Trump still maintains a small edge when it comes to economic issues. On most others, most notably the pandemic and on race relations, Biden enjoys a very large lead. But when registered voters were asked who they trusted more to handle the issue of immigration, the split was as follows: 43% for Joe Biden, 41% for Donald Trump, and 15% did not know or had no opinion. So basically, even though Trump is sounding more combative and more strident on the immigration issue, there's still a significant percentage of American voters who agree with his approach on this. And the fact that he and Biden are almost completely even on who the voters trust more on immigration is instructive. The other poll number is a reminder. It's one that I shared with you before from a couple of months ago. The Washington Post, University of Maryland, polled in late April, and they asked whether Americans supported temporarily pausing immigration, both legal and illegal, because of the pandemic. And so I'll remind you that just Monday, the president announced a plan to dramatically reduce legal immigration, which on one hand, as I talked about earlier, is a play for his base. But that post-University of Maryland poll showed that 65% of Americans, almost 2/3 of American voters, supported a temporary pause in immigration because of the pandemic. That includes 67% of independents, 61% of non-whites, overwhelmingly African American, and even 49% of Democrats called for a temporary stop. Excuse me, so these issues do cut in both directions. Now, the challenge for Joe Biden here, who's still running, by the way, Biden is still running behind Hillary Clinton when it comes to support from Latino voters, is Joe Biden, as we've talked about many times before, still has a Democratic base that's not that motivated behind his candidacy. And the trick for Biden here is if he pushes back too forcefully against Trump, he could lose some of those swing voters who we saw evidenced in the two polls that I just referenced. And if he does not push back forcefully, then that's one more reason that a Democratic base of voters of color and young people may not be all that excited for him. So Trump's certainly at a disadvantage here, but a real challenge for Biden going ahead also. Let's move on now to our final and our third category, and that is what we called earlier experienced voters, but I will call older voters for the sake of this conversation, although just for the record, know that I instruct my students at all three of the schools where I teach to refer to us not as older voters, but rather as voters of a certain age. So let's spend a minute or two talking about voters of a certain age before we move on to your questions and comments. So we're talking about older voters as a key group of swing voters in this election. And that in itself is important because it has been 20 years since voters 65 and older have supported the Democratic candidate for president. For 20 years now, older voters have supported Republicans for president. And back in 2016, Trump won that voter group by a very comfortable margin, by 9 or 10 points. Well, in polling out this week, it shows Biden with a very small but noticeable lead over Biden among voters 65 and over. He's 2 points ahead among that voter group. those voters, those older voters, have been the most loyal for Republicans for a generation now. And the fact that there's been a 12-point shift since 2016 speaks to how some of the heightened language that Trump was using earlier, while it may be motivating some aspects of his base, is driving away from some swing voters. Last week, we talked about how this was hurting him with white working class women. Today, we're seeing this language, while motivating his base, is also tending to start to drive seniors away. Today, for those of you who didn't see it, the New York Times took their poll, which yesterday showed Biden up by 14 points nationally, and they focused in even deeper on 6 key swing states, the 6 states that most experts believe will decide this election: the states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. Trump won all 6 of those states in 2016. Biden now has a lead in all 6 of those states, and in some of those states by double digits. And when they polled older voters in those states, some very interesting numbers came out. In 2016, in these 6 states, not in the country, in these 6 states, Trump won voters aged 65 and older by a 13-point margin. According to the Times poll this morning, Biden is winning these voters by 6 points. So while the overall shift among older voters has been a little bit more than 10 points in the nation, in the key swing states, the 6 states I mentioned a moment ago, Biden has shifted 20% of senior voters. 1 out of every 5 voters aged 65 and older has switched away from Trump since the 2016 election. Obviously, a lot more to talk about, but that's why we have our question period. And so, Jessica, I'm going to take a guess that we do have a few questions from the audience to consider. And so why don't we get to them?
Great. Yes, we do. Start with a focus on education. Those are the questions coming in first. One question is, with all the cautions about public restrooms, how can restrooms in schools be made safe for our children when they are designed for compactness, ventilation is poor, and social distancing impossible?
Okay. Jessica, I'm so sorry. At least my feed, I don't know about anyone else, cut out for just a moment. So could I ask you if you wouldn't mind repeating the question?
Sure. Can you hear me better now?
No, I can. I can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. With all the cautions about public restrooms, how can restrooms in schools be made safe for our children when they are designed for compactness, ventilation is poor, and social distancing impossible?
Okay, well, this is not an area in which I'm an expert, but what I've read as part of the broader discussion of how schools must prepare to have students back during a time of social distancing is restrooms, like every aspect of the schools, are going to need to be cleaned almost constantly. Not just restrooms, but the classrooms themselves, the cafeterias, the hallways, constant cleaning. And if you add to that the fact that students are going to have to be 6 feet away from each other, that means fewer students in a classroom. And the net impact, whether it's cleaning, whether it's distance, the very important safety measures that schools need to take, it's going to cost an immense amount of money. And school districts and superintendents in California and throughout the country are already reminding their state government leaders that this is money that they don't have. And during an economic downturn in which states are cutting their budgets, in most areas, including K through 12 education, we're asking our schools and we're asking our school districts to accomplish this kind of cleaning and distancing, as expensive as it is, with even less money available than they've had under more normal circumstances. So if and when the reopening of the schools happens come August and September, they know what to do from a hygiene standpoint. The challenge is going to be finding the money to do it.
Thank you. I actually worked at a Montessori school when I was younger, and so I was constantly sick. I mean, the kids are super cute, but they are definitely notorious for spreading germs. So yeah, the teachers will be also at risk of being exposed as well.
Well, and as we talked about earlier, and I think it is worth spending another moment on it, even if very few school-age children become severely ill as a result of the pandemic, the fact that they're in such close proximity to each other and then going home at the end of the day creates real peril for parents and for grandparents. I think the point on this that is worth making is that respiratory viruses in general, not just COVID-19, but most respiratory viruses spread very easily from child to child. And so that means they're going to spread from household to household. And so when you put people together in a mixed environment, a daily mass gathering of children with teachers, you're setting up opportunities for extraordinary transmission of the virus. You're exactly right, Jessica.
How could you do blended learning if parents aren't doing blended working?
Well, that's the challenge. And whether students are partially at home or completely at home, it's going to be very difficult for a lot of parents, particularly those from low-income households and many minority communities, to return to work at all. The poll that I cited earlier also asked respondents not just about K through 12 education and university education. It asked about childcare facilities as well. And the majority of Americans are also very nervous about childcare facilities reopening. And so practically speaking, the questioner is absolutely right, which is if the schools don't open and childcare is not available for the same health-related reasons, then even parents who want to return to work may not be able to. And those who are forced to return to work, for those who are forced to return to work, it creates an even greater challenge.
Great, thank you. Do you think colleges should reduce fees for students if they opt to programs other than in person, especially if they opt for online only? Should students be automatically allowed without penalty a leave of absence?
Well, polling shows that 90% of students believe that tuition ought to be reduced in fall semester if their education continues online, which looks like it's going to be the case at the overwhelming majority of colleges and universities around the country. Because I'm employed by 3 of those universities, I want to be a little bit circumspect in what I say. But what I will tell all of you from personal experience is that learning how to teach on an online platform in 6 days this spring was an extraordinarily difficult challenge for me and for a lot of my colleagues. I like to joke about it. I say for most of the spring, I felt a lot like a silent movie actor being forced into talkies. But I will tell you that as hard as I tried, I know I did not provide my students with as quality an educational experience as I hope they were able to get during in-person teaching. And while I'm devoting a great deal of time this summer to learning how to be a more effective teacher online, I know that the product I deliver them will not compare to what would exist in an in-person setting. And so it's not surprising that so many students and their parents do believe that they ought to be asked to pay less for an educational experience of lower quality.
Yeah, but I would say our experience at the council, we are able to have so many more people join us on your talks, and we get to see you more frequently. So there's been a lot of added value, I think, for us getting to have these with you every week as opposed to once a month in Culver City. So I would say that added value is something to be considered.
But I will point out that while we have large numbers of very loyal participants, which I think you and I are both very flattered by, Jessica, the overwhelming majority of our participants do not get graded on what I tell them. And so that might raise the stake for some of the students.
Something for us to consider.
Good idea.
Is it possible that universities are hesitant to hold in-person classes because they'd like to avoid liability problems?
Well, the liability question is a critically important one. And we talked about it some weeks ago as it related to businesses. And most of the participants in our webinar that week, when we asked a poll question, do you think businesses ought to be offered protection from lawsuits filed by those who contract COVID-19 either as employees or as customers? Very large majorities oppose that idea. But while businesses are looking for that kind of protection, so are schools and so are hospitals and a university, an elementary or secondary school, or a childcare facility faces a considerable a very, very difficult situation, when on top of everything else, they may need to worry about students or their parents taking legal matters. I suspect that there'll be some kind of liability protection offered for schools. Otherwise, their reopening becomes even more challenging than we've already discussed.
Thank you. I'm curious about the fate of parochial schools and that impact on the state's education budget. If thousands of students leave the private schools because they're unable to pay tuition and other reasons because of the pandemic, how do Sacramento and public schools absorb that new cost of education?
I have to tell you, as hard as I work to prepare for these programs every week, that is a question I've not heard. And it's a really, really smart one. Because if a parochial school or a private school of any of any derivation cannot or chooses not to offer schooling to their children, then the public schools obviously are the only option available to parents. And the challenge of additional students, and therefore the challenge of additional school crowding, is a problem at any point. Particularly in lower income communities, this teacher to student ratio is unforgivable. But you add on to that the difficulties presented by a pandemic. Not only are we putting too many kids into a classroom with each teacher, but at a time when we have to employ social distancing, it's hard to figure out exactly where those additional kids are going to be. There's only so many classes that can be taught in gymnasiums and cafeterias, in auditoriums. But as difficult as social distancing is with a static number of children, if that number increases to a relevant degree, it gets even more difficult. I suspect that alternate day learning is an option that many schools are already considering and will almost be forced to take on, the idea being that a student comes to school Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and does their blended learning, as we talked about earlier, from home on the other 3 days. That becomes, rather than a possible option for most schools, it becomes pretty much a necessity.
Thank you. How can school districts deal with the practical considerations of special ed, given the federal requirements that already exist?
Another almost mind-boggling challenge, because as difficult as it is to provide a quality online learning experience for many children, those who have special needs require even more time and attention. And depending on the nature of those special needs, interpersonal interaction from a teacher or some type of authority figure is an absolutely critical part of their learning, because it provides some type of emotional guidance that's much more difficult to duplicate online. Parents of special needs children, of course, they have workplace demands just like any other parent would. And I think if, for children, a child in special education, it's hard to imagine how their parents could return to work in an era of distance or blended learning. And while there's been some preliminary conversations at the state level here in California or elsewhere about the need to address the issue, while advocates are appropriately raising real concern, if not alarm, there hasn't been much done. There hasn't been much done at all in most states to address the issue, besides agreeing that it is one that needs closer attention. But right now, not nearly enough is happening on that front.
Thank you. Do you think the Supreme Court ruling on DACA will make it easier for the executive branch to make law?
Will it be easier for the executive branch to make law because of the court's decision on DACA? I don't know if I'd use the word easier, because what the court did is they did not say that Trump was forbidden from ending DACA. They said that his rationale for doing so, and the means by which his administration tried to do it, did not offer credible evidence that it was the right course of action. So what the Roberts Court was essentially doing is daring the Trump administration, saying, hey, if you want to implement or to end a program like this, you've got to do it more effectively. We're not philosophically opposed to ending DACA, said a majority of the justices. The administration just didn't do it as up to the standards that a court normally requires. So what the court is telling the Trump administration and other government entities is not we're taking power away from you, but we are demanding that you offer a satisfactory explanation as to why you take those steps. So the term easier is a tricky one, because on one hand, the court essentially provided a path that would make it easier for a government to end or begin a program like this one by executive order. But they're raising the bar on how it needs to be implemented. So I guess theoretically it's more accessible. Maybe that's a better word than easier. But it does require a larger amount of effort on the part of that government entity. Muddled answer, but I'd say that it's not necessarily easier for government, but more accessible is probably the bottom line.
Thank you. This next one says, hi, Dan. What do you think of Democrats' efforts to block Republican Senator Tim Scott's police reform bill? It doesn't completely ban chokeholds, but seems to address many key issues. Why would they block this?
Well, the Republican bill on police reform is not nearly as ambitious as what the Senate Democrats wanted or what the Democrats in the House of Representatives are in the process of passing. As the questioner correctly observed, the Republican bill, authored by Republican Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, the only African American Republican senator, does not forbid chokeholds and other prohibitive restraint techniques as the Democratic bill does, but it withholds funding from police departments that don't ban the practice. So this is less a matter of disagreement over whether chokeholds are bad. Everyone seems to agree that they are. The question is whether the federal government should mandate their banishment or whether that's a decision that should be left to local governments with a very strong federal disincentive. My own opinion, I'm not taking sides on this, is particularly on an issue of such great import. I understand why Senator Schumer and the Democrats tactically decided not to bring the bill to the floor for debate. But this is such an important issue, and it is such a large amount of public attention at such a critical time. My advice to Senator Schumer would have been let the bill get to the floor and debate in public the things that you don't like about it. I realize it sounds like I'm echoing Republican talking points, but I'm not, because there are things about the bill that I do agree are inadequate. But that said, at a time of such heightened public interest, I was disappointed that we're not going to have a higher profile debate on this issue in the Senate the way we deserve. I recognize that Senator Schumer and Senator Harris and other Democrats feel justifiably that they were not included to the degree they would have liked in the drafting of the bill, and they have a legitimate point there. But again, as a former political advisor, my advice there would have been complain about not being included, talk about what you don't like about the bill, and establish the biggest and broadest and highest public platform possible to argue it back and forth, rather than simply killing it. So the Republican bill may be an imperfect vehicle, but I guess I would have liked to have seen it debated on the Senate floor, and I'm disappointed that was not the case.
Yeah, Senator Scott, I watched a 30-minute speech that he gave about exactly this topic, about how he's trying to find opportunities to address the issues that the Democrats feel aren't in the bill. And I think on the chokehold, he mentioned that it's basically in the Constitution, that is something that they're not allowed to do. So there was some technicalities, but I would suggest watching that 30-minute speech of his. And yeah, I think it's such an important issue that hopefully both sides will come together to actually fix it and to not keep campaigning on it. I think that would be good for the country.
Well, you and I have convinced each other, Jessica. Let's just agree that we're the first concentric circle, and now we just need to work outward.
Sounds good.
It is worth noting that the provision over chokeholds is not the only problem the Democrats have with Senator Scott's bill. It's the most visible. There are several other things they don't think are adequate. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that it's coming down to the type of technical matter that you talked about. There are profound differences. But again, as I think we both agree, the best way to settle those differences is to discuss and debate them in public.
100%. All right. Considering how people talk publicly about Trump supporters, wanting them fired, calling them racists, that Trump supporters would Trump supporters answer honestly on a national poll when it's hard for anything to be anonymous nowadays?
So it's a really, really smart question about the way public opinion polling is done. And the president himself and many of his advisors have cast doubts on many public opinion polls because they feel that their supporters are somewhat reluctant to offer honest opinions. What we've found in research that's been done is that is a legitimate concern on phone polling, not just for Donald Trump supporters, but for other voters who are reluctant to share an opinion they think might be unpopular or met with disapproval by the questioner. That said, we don't see that same dynamic when it comes to online polling. For whatever the reason, the average person who doesn't want their opinion, who doesn't want to share their opinion if they think it might be met with disapproval, they don't want to tell an anonymous person on the phone what their opinion is, but they're much more comfortable clicking a box on an online survey. And on the polls that we've been talking about, at least today, there's not a significant difference between online and phone polling. So I understand the questioner's concern, but evidence does not bear out a real disparity on these questions. So there's no guarantee they're being answered accurately. But I think being able to compare the online to the phone polling is of some help. The other point I'd make very quickly, and this is something that's helpful not just on this question, but more broadly when you look at public opinion polls, I would encourage you to never spend too much time thinking about the actual numbers themselves, whether one candidate's at 51% and one's at 49, if one's at 55% and the other's at 45. The most important information to take from any public opinion poll are not the numbers themselves, but rather the trajectory of those numbers. If support for a candidate or an issue is growing, even if people are unwilling to share their opinions with pollsters, the fact that support is growing for something is instructive. On the other hand, if a candidate's support is shrinking or support for a particular issue is shrinking, we don't know how many of those respondents are telling the truth and how many are frightened to. But because we can compare it to a similar poll taken a week, 2 weeks, a month earlier, we can see the trending. So for example, we have no idea whether Joe Biden is really 14 points ahead of Donald Trump, as the New York Times says, or 9 points ahead, as Politico says, or whether the race is even. We don't know. But what we do know is that polling over the last several weeks, the last 3 months really, since mid-March, has been moving steadily upward for Biden and steadily downward for Trump. And while that doesn't completely account for the questioner's concerns, I think it does offer some reassurance that even if we don't know exactly where the race stands, we know what direction it's headed.
Thank you. Should Republican members of Congress rebuke President Trump for exposing so many of their constituents to the virus?
Well, I think one of the most important things we've seen with this resurgence of the virus just over the last several days, the tremendous growth in the number of cases, the transmission rate, and of hospitalizations, is the locale of those incidents is shifting. When we first started talking about this back in March or April, I cited statistics then that showed how many more of the cases of COVID-19 identified were in states that had been carried by Hillary Clinton versus states that had been carried by Donald Trump, and how many more cases had been identified in counties that Clinton had won versus counties that Trump had won, because at that point, the preponderance of COVID-19 cases were occurring in urban areas that tend to vote very heavily Democratic. Well, now over the last few weeks, we're seeing a shift, and the outbreaks are moving from urban and suburban America to rural and small town America. They're moving from coastal big cities to the south into the southwest. So I think one of the most interesting things to watch over the next few weeks is to see whether public opinion changes as well. In other words, will Trump's supporters, who generally followed his lead in minimizing the impact of the virus, will they continue to follow him? Or because these cases are now so much more frequent in their own communities, will they then rethink their positions? If they stick with the president, then my guess is their elected members of Congress will too. But if you see Southern and Southwestern and rural and small town America becoming less supportive of the president's approach on this, then you may see Republican members of Congress speaking out to a greater degree than they have in the past.
Thank you. If Biden has an enthusiasm problem with his base, why doesn't he align more with the progressives who are highly motivated in getting out the vote?
Well, the difficult situation that Biden is in, albeit with a lead in the polls, is that to some degree, well, I've talked to all of you about this before. Every campaign to be successful must accomplish two things simultaneously. Number one, you have to motivate your base. You have to make sure that your most loyal supporters turn out to vote. But second, you also have to persuade undecided voters. Now, Donald Trump, as we've discussed before, probably spends less time trying to talk to the political center than any presidential candidate, at least any general election presidential candidate in modern history. Biden understands that he has to accomplish both of these goals. And my guess is that Biden and his advisors are smart enough to understand that to some degree, that base motivation on one hand versus talking to voters in the center on the other can be somewhat of a zero-sum game. In other words, the more time you spend talking to voters in the center, the more demotivated your base becomes, which I think is the premise of the questioner's point. On the other hand, the more time you spend motivating your base with an extremely liberal or an extremely conservative message, the more likely you are to alienate those swing voters. So Biden has to do both. And not only does he have to find a way to motivate young people and voters from minority communities, he needs to find a way to do so in a way that doesn't cede arguments over issues like immigration and public safety to Trump. We don't have time for a more detailed discussion of it today. Perhaps next we can talk about young voters rather than older voters. But one of the other really interesting things in this New York Times poll and other recent polling is that young people in general, but more specifically young people of color, are very demotivated by Trump, by Biden and his candidacy. And into the question we've been discussing, Biden's difficulty is figuring out a way to talk to those potential voters without doing anything that drives the center away. The question I asked 2 weeks ago is still valid. Will June's protesters become November's voters? And if the answer is yes, Joe Biden probably becomes president. If not, then it becomes more likely that Biden suffers the same fate that Secretary Clinton did 4 years ago. And if Biden himself is not able to motivate those particular voters, the question is whether there are other voices who can do so on his behalf. And we don't know the answer to that yet.
Thank you. Will Trump talking about some of the online personalities discussing or encouraging tearing down statues of Jesus help Trump with evangelicals?
So this is a really good example of the previous question. So I think most right-minded people would agree that statues of Confederate leaders ought to come down or at least be taken out of public squares and put into museums. And we can argue about the means by which those decisions are made, but the very large majorities of the American public believe that those statues ought to come down. Others are trickier. Ulysses S. Grant, the general and then president who fought the Civil War to free the slaves and who freed his own slaves, had a statue in San Francisco that was taken down. There are other examples around the country of what I'd say diplomatically more debatable individuals whose statues have been taken down. And one particularly strident voice suggested that statues of Jesus should come down because many argue that there is evidence that Jesus himself was not white but was a person of color. Now, I don't have enough intelligence to engage in that debate. I don't know what the answer is. But for Trump, this is the kind of overreach that can give him an opportunity, not just with his base of religious conservative voters, but with swing voters who on one hand don't like the idea of Confederate generals being honored with statues, but are a little bit more nervous with statues of Jesus being taken down as well. Last week, we talked about this dynamic as it related to police reform. Those who said Black Lives Matter and who wanted to reimagine how policing was done are voters who Biden has been working very hard to appeal to. Those who say defund the police, and a number of those who called for an absolute abolishing of police in their communities. Those are voters who Biden recognizes he could lose if he were to adopt that more extreme position. So once again, as we talked about with the previous question, for Biden, it's a balance. If you motivate, if you talk to your base too much, it loses the center. And the statue conversation is a perfect example of the very fine line that he has to walk.
Thank you. Why don't the Republicans try to appeal to immigrants?
Well, this has been an ongoing debate in the Republican Party for many years. You may remember that after the 2012 election, the Republican National Committee appointed a blue ribbon commission to explore why Republican candidates were having such a difficult time in national elections after two consecutive defeats at the hands of Barack Obama. And the most important finding that this commission presented back to the Republican National Committee was that the party needed to adjust its efforts on immigration policy. And given the sweeping demographic transformations that our country and our electorate are facing, this Blue Ribbon Commission, of very smart political strategists, said the party simply has to become more accommodating on immigration issues. And as many of you may remember, in the fall of 2015 and the spring of 2016, many candidates took the advice of that commission. Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, John Kasich, and many others. What Donald Trump recognized, and he was not the only one, but certainly to the most extreme degree, he recognized that while those recommendations might help a Republican candidate in some ways with some voters, there were large numbers of Republican voters in the grassroots around the country who were not interested in being nearly as accommodating on immigration issues. So on the very first day of Donald Trump's candidacy back in 2015, when he talked about immigration in a very confrontational and combative way, those voters began to shift to him. And so I think there are a number of Republican Party leaders who would like to accomplish that shift. And it'll be interesting in a post-Trump era, whether that era starts in January of 2021 or January of 2025, whether Trump's supporters, who are much more confrontational on immigration issues, whether they inherit the party, or whether at that point there becomes more of a discussion about how Republicans can change an approach to immigration for both political and policy reasons.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's going to be my last question because I know we're right up to 12 o'clock. So thank you so much. Kim, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Jessica, so much. Dan, what an informative discussion as always. I can't wait till next Thursday. So everybody, Dan's back next Thursday at 11 o'clock, Politics and the Time for Coronavirus. And remember, we have June 30th, we have Dr. Richard Haas, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, moderated by Doyle McManus, who is Washington columnist for the LA Times. And July 1st, we have Crisis Leadership, The Road to Recovery, with Christine Essel, President and CEO of Southern California Grantmakers, Gregory Scott, President and CEO of the Community Action Partnership, and Corinne Bendersky, Professor of Management and Organizations at UCLA Anderson. Everybody stay safe, stay informed, and we will see you next week. Thank you. Thanks, Dan, so much.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.